So thanks everybody for joining us tonight. Another wonderful workshop delivered today by Mandiant. I hope everyone who attended the KPMG workshop yesterday really had a fun time. It seemed like from the feedback that I had, it was a good experience. But today we have Mandiant presenting um, their talk on red team engagements and incident response, delivered by Kenny and Andrew. So thank you, Kenny and Andrew, for putting together this workshop. In their workshop, they'll be talking about a case study that they experienced regarding a rather unique experience where a client had multiple attackers on their network. So really interesting topic. So Kenny, I'll pass off the mic to you. You can feel free to start your stream and take it away.
All right. Hopefully this is working. Can you see my screen? It should be the PowerPoint page.
Yep, we can.
Awesome. Perfect. Excellent. Well, first of all, thank you everyone so much, everyone involved, having us here. Andrew and I have done a presentation before. This one's going to be a little bit different. It's actually going to be performing a red team and incident response, as was discussed. So we'll just jump right into it. Right. So I'm Kenny Hartlob, and this is Andrew Major, and we will be first jumping into the performance of a red team using fictitious names. Pretty much everything that you'll be seeing is real, has happened. It's just things will be changed up, names, places, dates, uh, that sort of thing. So obviously, okay. So first of all, who am I? My name is Kenny, as I've said several times now. And I live out here in Ottawa, nearby, kind of. Been on the Mandiant Red Team for about 2 years now. Previously, I was a United States Air Force veteran. Well, I'm still a veteran. Security forces, basically military policeman for a few years. Got out, got into cybersecurity, went to Sheridan, joined the information systems program there. And it's been fantastic, the amount of knowledge that I learned there. And kind of transitioned that into other avenues of offensive security, which I have discussed on previous presentations, so I won't really get into. But right now, currently, the past few years, I've been a huge nerd, being a dungeon master, and I'm actually part of the Big Brother Big Sister Ottawa program. I'm a technical big brother to a little, and so that's what I typically do on my weekends, D&D, and be awesome. So, and I'm also always on the mission to hack the planet for the greater good, because I mean that's why we're here, probably, right? Everyone wants to kind of learn how to be good one way or the other. Yep, gotta hack that planet. Okay, so we're gonna get into what our red team mission is going to be, how we're gonna perform that. Okay, we're gonna be going through the different phases, and what we typically start off with, and what it all should start off with, is what your mission is going to be, your open source intelligence, how you're going to really enumerate the perimeter and identify different vulnerabilities to exploit, or avenues of entry such as phishing. And we're going to get into all that, down to what payload we're going to use, right? So in order to really bypass their perimeter security, and what we're going to do when we get the initial access, followed by completing the mission objectives. Okay. And then really everything else is just ours, right? I mean, that's the whole point of a red team, usually, just to make sure that we accomplish the objectives, and whatever network data access that we needed to get, we achieved it. So the typical red team life cycle usually has these 8 phases, okay, where we're going to do that initial reconnaissance, checking on the perimeter, what is available for us to exploit, okay? And we're also going to gather all that intel and utilize it to perform the actual compromise. Okay. Now, when we do that, we are going to be looking for not just scanning IPs and URLs and domains and all that jazz. No, we're also going to be looking at who are the employees, what do they do? Is there anyone of particular interest that we actually want to target here? And then once we get that initial access, how are we going to establish a foothold, maintain that persistence, basically, and strengthen our current position, right? And a lot of that is going to be involved around the next 4 phases, which is going to be escalating our privileges, doing more reconnaissance, moving laterally to the next step or to the next system that will give us even more access where we will continuously maintain. And then do that cycle over again until we accomplish each of the objectives. All right. So who's our target? Well, our target for this example is going to be Hammerfist Corporation. They deal with nuclear energy stuffs. Who knows? But it's going to be awesome. Okay. And our objectives are going to be to bypass the perimeter security. Okay. And on a red team, it's assumed you will be getting complete compromise of the network. It never stops there on a red team. It's you get domain admin or enterprise admin, whatever the objective will be, and then you continuously exploit, do your post exploitation, do your data exfiltration, whatever it's going to be, right? In this instance, we have been defined the objective by the client, Hammerfists, to access the CISO mailbox. Doesn't matter how, we got to do it. We also need to exfiltrate confidential data. We don't know what that confidential data is. We have to identify it. Next, they made this one, they just snuck this one right in there, and that is to try to access an air-gapped nuclear network. Well, if it's air-gapped, we shouldn't be able to do that, right? Just remember that. Okay, so first step, we're going to do our OSINT. This is super important, okay? Because when you're trying to get your IPs and your subdomains and trying to understand what the company is, like you're enumerating what the websites are, and there are going to be hundreds, right? And you have to really correlate all that data as effectively as efficiently as possible. And you kind of have a time clock here, right? So on a red team, you're not given an unlimited amount of time. You're given a couple weeks, maybe a few months, definitely, but you got to be thorough, right? So you can't have shortcuts here. Okay, so we're going to get all the information that we possibly can to then use against the target and to achieve the objectives, right? Such information also includes password leaks. There's so much different types of breach data out there that is easily to gather, and you can quickly acquire it in many different websites that I won't get into, which I'm sure you all can do your own research on. And what you can basically do with that data is analyze it and discover, well, maybe there's a common pattern of passwords here. Maybe Hammerfist's corporation, a lot of the users from previous data dumps, they use the same kind of password, like welcome12345 when they're new users, or maybe they just hammer and it's permeated with h@mmer, right? There's a lot of detail that you can get from that data to then consecutively use for other attacks. It's fantastic. In addition, when you're going through that breach data, you might discover other usernames in that process, and you're going to use that later on for the different types of employees who you're going to be gathering, right? In addition, got to look at the public code repositories out there. I don't know how many times I found sensitive data, credentials, SSH keys, all sorts of stuff in the Git history, right? Once they push it, they commit it, and it's public, and there's so many different developers that have like their own personal GitHub repo that they do work stuff on, and they just forget and they put it out there, and yeah, it's fantastic. So you want to gather all that data that you possibly can. And this is all just open source, right? Including employees, right? There's so many different social media platforms out there. There's a lot that you can gather online to really understand a company, especially their employees, right? You go on Glassdoor, right? Get a feel for what the company's about, right? Go on to LinkedIn. You're going to be looking for who does what, right? Because you don't want to accidentally target someone you probably want to avoid. Someone that might be like the CISO, for instance. You kind of want to know who that is, for sure. You maybe want to target him or her or the actual mission objective, but there might be other subtle ways to do that instead that won't trigger anything. Same thing when you're picking out your targets. You might want to avoid anyone in the IT security sector, or you want to avoid different individuals that might only be temporary, which actually can be a good thing, but other times it might mean that they might not have the access that you require. Another big thing that a lot of people miss is documents and metadata, especially. I don't know how many times I have figured out the naming schema for usernames to use and to correlate and basically compile a list out of for password sprayable portals, right? So when you're doing your reconnaissance, you're going to be looking for domains that might have a login portal, that might have not just email, but virtual desktop interfaces. code repositories, all that. And if you can get a a match on how they have their login process, what their username is going to be, because it might not always be their email, right? You might have to discover something else. I've been on cases where I went through metadata and I found that they have numbers. Now you can brute force the numbers, and that was great. But before that, I was hitting portals with emails because I thought that was the way in. But the SAM accounts were not matching the metadata. So it's very important you gather all the information you possibly can. Now, while we're here, we're going to start probing the perimeter. When we do that, we're specifically looking for places to password spray. We're going to kick off a password spray at the same time we're doing the other pieces and phases of the red team. Okay, so we're going to be targeting a few places, but we have to really figure out the correct thing to target first, right? We don't want to just spray everything. That'd be bad. And we got to be quiet. So we discovered that there's a company wiki site. Problem is that not everyone actually has access to Confluence. There might be some developers, there might be some engineers, maybe, sure, but in some cases, not everyone would be given access, or if they were, it's some other kind of credential that they won't even use for the regular stuff, and we're just going to skip over that. We discovered that they have a Jira ticketing issue system. That's good too. That'd be good to have. There's a lot of good data in there, but again, they might not use the same type of accounts that we would gather, or maybe only certain users have access to it. So we're going to keep looking. And when we discover they have a Citrix, right? They have a VDI. What's good about a VDI is that that's kind of almost, if you can get into a VDI system or just a portal really as any user, you can nearly in every case be able to access the file system directly and get a shell, okay? Now, how are we going to do that? Well, we really have to make sure they have weak password policies, because that's the whole point of password spraying. And we got to make sure that we're not doing it at every go. We're not going to spray all 3,000 some odd users all at one time. No, we're going to make it nice and slow, okay? We're going to make sure that it is maybe 30 to 45 seconds randomly picked between there, so a nice jitter, right? And it's just going to hit the portal one at a time. It could take a few weeks even. I've seen it take 2 weeks for a whole pass to go through. But that low and slow methodology is going to be very, very important so you don't get detected. That's the whole point, because we're on a red team. So while we're doing that, and really the whole results of this is that there was, I don't know why it says 24/7, but it's supposed to say 247 successes, right? And we had summer 2021, June 2021 exclamation point, right? These are predictable passwords, okay? Very predictable. And to the point where once, in some instances, while we were using the passwords of different users, they actually would change them. And we could easily guess it. Like if it was June 2021 and then suddenly it's August while we're on this assessment, well, it's August or the different season, whatever it is. Sometimes I just removed the exclamation point. It was very easy. A lot of people don't realize what a great attack vector password spraying is and how quickly it can get you into things. However, problem with this, even though we have so many successes, like Kenny, why don't you have so many shells? They also have MFA. And unfortunately, it wasn't a push MFA. If it was push, it'd be great, right? I would just trigger it at about 9 a.m. I would spam it maybe until the user gave up hitting decline, that they would hit accept, and then it would give me access. That's happened plenty of times. But this instance, they actually had to manually put in the code, which was good to see, but bad for us. Okay. So we're going to keep probing the perimeter while we're getting all these passwords. Now, we're going to use these passwords for later, okay? That's what's very important here. So we discovered that there's a web application, and it is vulnerable to a very specific vulnerability. And this vulnerability was only able to be discovered from directory brute forcing the application and discovering a unique directory. In this directory, we could browse it, and there was a testing page. It was a default page. And there was a version number in the comment. We then just quickly Google search this version number, and we find that there is a file upload vulnerability, okay, that we could basically put a web shell, right? So we need to tweak it a bit. And what we're going to do in this instance, what we did really was upload a shell that was going to do basic enumeration, because we don't want to flag anything, right? So this information is going to come back with who it is, what interfaces are there, what permissions is there and what kind of defenses the system has. And overall, we discovered that it was pretty isolated. It was not domain joined, oddly, and there was only so much that we could do on it. Now, it was good, definitely, to test and to have that initial access. And we actually did discover that there was some attack vectors, but the risk and the reward wasn't quite there. We were going to put it on the back burner for now and come back to it later. There might be easier avenues of approach here, right? A lot of red teaming is taking the path of least resistance because normally it's usually the easiest way in and it's the quicker way in. But in this instance, we had it as a backup just in case. So instead, we're going to do some fishing, right? We're going to pick 20 some odd targets out of 3,000 users because we want to make it nice and slow. And we're going to send out an email. And because we identified the Citrix portal, we want users, because we live in a pandemic era right now, everyone is mostly remote. And we know that a lot of users are going to have access to this Citrix gateway, right? So what we're going to do is we are going to send them a email stating that, hey, we need you all to update your current drivers to access the remote portal. Because maybe some people call it Citrix, maybe some people call it NetScaler, we don't know. Or maybe they just call it the portal. We have to be very careful how we word our phishing email. Now, this portal is hosted on a fake website, obviously, and it is under our control. And when they log in, we will actually indeed get their credentials, which is kind of good to have. We don't need them per se because we're actually targeting the users that we compromised from the password sprite. Okay. The reason why is because if we are able to get access to anything, then we can then use that for later on. Okay. So, but we need the clear text credential to do that. So, how are we going to do that? Well, we're going to package an ISO file. Okay. Now, this ISO file, the reason why we're going to use an ISO file is because when nowadays it just automatically mounts, right? It's great. It evades so much defenses. And that's what we're going to use. But in this ISO file, once the user downloads, it doesn't matter what browser they use, it's going to be an MSI file. Now that MSI file is going to, when they launch it, it will drop a very small file. And this file is a configuration file. And then it's going to copy a local Microsoft legitimate binary to that same directory that it put that very small file. Okay. This technique is known as the app domain manager injection. And it was very popular. Nowadays, it's getting kind of detected a lot now, but it's still heavily utilized for a lot of different environments. And what's going to happen is once that add-in util.exe launches, it's going to look inside the config file and figure out, okay, where's the DLL that I got to use? And that DLL is going to be remote. And it's going to automatically download it onto a temporary area onto disk. And we want this to be hidden from the user. So if the user is updating their Citrix, they already have Citrix installed on their system, which means that they already have it somewhere in their app data. So we are doing a lot of assumption here, but I mean, you're going to see it's going to work. And boom, we get 2 beacons immediately. C Willowgas and F Tusktooth, right? Immediately. I'd say we got about maybe 9 beacons total, and we'll get into more of that then. But we immediately have obtained the first objective, right? And that was to bypass the perimeter security. Now, we did do this technically on the external app. However, we don't really see that as the initial access. We see that as more of a secondary access for later, right? So let's review real quick. We launched a phishing campaign against 21 employees out of 3,000 some odd. The reason why is because this is a red team. We got to be quiet. We don't want to set off so many defenses, right? And we're not sending them all off at once. We're sending off like maybe 5 or 10 every hour or 3 hours, whatever it is, right? Because then that will tell us what kind of detections that they have. Is anyone reporting it? If not, are the next round going to go through? And we usually adapt accordingly, okay? So we have our ISO image with a malicious MSI, and we get 9 beacon callbacks, which is great. Some of them might kill off, others wouldn't, and we can then establish persistence. Now, normally, you're going to have a resilient setup, meaning you're going to have a team server, or your main server, that's going to be doing a lot of the heavy lifting for the initial access, right? That's kind of like your burner there, because what might happen is that the blue team is going to go through and discover your phishing campaign. They're going to discover your payload, and then game over, right? You're going to have to find a way to establish persistence that might go to a different team server, okay? And that external app, well, we're going to keep that, right? We might need that for later. So we're going to keep that low privilege, non-domain joined access. We can escalate our privilege to system onto that actual system, so system net authority, but it might be a little loud. So, like I said, we're gonna leave that for later, just in case. Okay. There's other attack paths we could use, like dumping credentials, maybe, but they have some pretty effective EDR there, and we don't want to burn ourselves just yet. So, while we're on the inside from the initial access, let's start doing our post exploitation. Kerber roasting has been talked about before at ISSessions, and so I won't get into it too much, but we are going to target service accounts to grab their tickets, do offline brute force cracking, right? Now, what's great about this attack is that you can query for these service principal name users and then take that hash, use it offline, but you got to be low and slow about it. A lot of companies might have canaries, basically, like little honey user accounts that look really good, and you might grab it, but it's probably too good to be true. So you really got to identify that and determine if that's what's worth it. Luckily for us, we saw one user and their password wasn't set for, wow, so long. Like, I'm sure we all know how great GPU cracking stations have become lately, especially for the Bitcoin era now, and we already can tell that this will likely be a very quick crack. So we're going to take that and we're going to put that into our password cracker for now, right? We'll put it on a 1080 Ti, let's say, and we'll see how long it takes. While that's happening, we're going to do another post-exploitation method using Bloodhound. Pretty sure Bloodhound has been talked about here before. You don't have to use Bloodhound. You can just use straight up LDAP queries, which I do recommend for red teaming because Bloodhound can get detected quite significantly now. But you can modify it a bit maybe to get by. And in this instance, we're not going to run Bloodhound all willy-nilly, right? We're going to make sure that it's nice and slow. We're just going to query the DC, but one at a time, right? First for groups, then for users, then for ACLs, right? We're not going to just run just DC only, okay? Now, in this instance, we identified that there's 2 domain admins. Not a lot of wiggle room there, okay? But one of them is a service account, which is good to know. Only because maybe they don't reset their password often. Maybe if we were to compromise the domain admins, maybe if we were to get DC sync privileges, we can get that hash. Maybe it would be easy to crack, or they wouldn't reset it so quickly. Depends. That other user, So we're also going to look at the user that we did crack, okay? Because or that we did get the Kerberos ticket for, okay? And we see that VM Backup is actually a member of the mailbox administrators. Weird. They also have a generic all on the entire domain, meaning they can make changes to the domain. Now, we're not going to make any changes. Instead, we're just going to replicate some, okay? Now, to do that, we're going to crack that password. That might take some time. Luckily for us, the password was set in 2007. That won't take long. In fact, it was a permeation of Zoolander. It was great. Blue Steel himself, right? Very quick, a very fantastic password that we're now going to make a context token out of, and we're going to do a DC sync. So we're going to do a DC sync for the ham admin user that was the service account that was a domain admin, and we're going to get that hash. Now, we are effectively domain admin. Why? Because we were able to replicate changes from a domain controller. Now, when we do this, we need to make sure that we do not do this from a regular system. Okay, we need to do this from another domain controller because that could get flagged. If we're just coming from a computer system, we're like, hey, we're just a normal computer system. We want to make domain controller changes where all the hashes are and all the juicy data is at. That's going to get you detected. Okay. Thankfully, this VM backup user had access to domain controller, so they were able to actually get onto a domain controller as system and then perform the DC sync from that system. And that's going to remain way under the radar. It's nearly impossible to detect. It's still possible, but it's very difficult. So again, boom, another mission objective complete. Now, remember that group that we were part of, the mailbox administrators? Do you think we could, do 2 objectives in one? Well, Yep, that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to access their Exchange Admin Center, and we're going to dump the CISO's mailbox. Pretty simple. Actually, in fact, we were a little worried about this because we know this CISO might have a lot of very sensitive data, so we just let them know, and they were like, yep, that is plenty, mission accomplished. We're like, cool. Blue Steel, again, gave us that access, and we were able to accomplish 2 objectives all in one from a simple fan of Zoolander and not resetting passwords or keeping up to date with them. Great, fantastic, awesome. Okay, on to the next objective, which is data exfiltration, right? We got to find some confidential data. Before we do that, we need to enumerate what's there. Now, we can't just let this go, right? We can't just scan every single system, okay? We need to get a list of servers, and you can do that in multiple different ways. You can just use the Bloodhound data that you have, right, in Neo4j, and go in there and query that, which is pretty effective if you did that Bloodhound collection. If you didn't, because you're trying to remain under the radar a little bit more, you're going to use LDAP queries, right? Just LDAP the query for Windows 2008, maybe Windows 2000, 2016, 2019, that kind of thing. You're going to look for servers, typically. And then from there, you're going to consolidate and then prioritize. Because you don't want to just hit every single thing at the same time, right? You might want to make a list of like 100. Maybe the environment has 500 potentially, high value target servers that you want to look at shares for. So you're going to break that down because a lot of this is patience. A lot of this is slow and easy. Okay, so now we're going to start scanning. Now, scanning, you're going to need to be low and slow, like I just said. Okay, you can't just go, banging and running your axe through every single thing that you see. No, you got to go nice, low, and slow. Have a nice little jitter there, just like with your password spraying that's still going on the external. Okay, and you're going to look for certain keywords because you're going to look for keywords for the file names and the share drives. Okay, for us, we were looking for secret, password, clearance, nuclear, anything that looked good, okay? So we were in luck. Within about 3 or 4 days, we were able to identify a shared drive that we had access to as a low privilege user, mind you, just a regular domain user that had no right to be there. Security clearance files with PII. This is great. So we can maybe forge our own, or an attacker would, but whatever. Now, we also find there is obviously heavily redacted nuclear documents here that were extremely confidential. And a firewall management server document randomly put there. Whatever. Okay. Mission objective complete. We exfiltrated confidential data. Client was happy. Well, they were a little sad, but they were happy that we were able to accomplish the objective to demonstrate the impact. Now, here's the problem. We have one last objective, and we're really having a hard time with this. Okay, we cannot fully identify the air-gapped nuclear network because, well, it's theoretically air-gapped. And they ask us that for sure. They hit us up. Hey, how's it going? Coming along. You got. I think we had about maybe a week left. Not very long, right? Now, during this whole step of the process, all these phases that we've been doing here, we have been keeping an eye out. We've been looking for those keywords. Anything, right? Even through the shares, we were looking through so much. And then we realized, okay, it's here. So what do we know? Well, we have that firewall management server documentation. Why don't we go there? Why don't we look at the metadata? We discovered it's by someone else that's not part of the company, but it references things of this company. So it's managed by a third party. We know that there's a server, and in fact, it looks to be domain joined according to our LDAP and Bloodhound data. And well, we can see it. Okay. This system talks about how, or this document talks about how it can, that this specific system is the only system that has allowed direct access to a firewall management system. And that firewall management system manages a cluster of nuclear firewall systems. Okay. And we now know what we need to compromise. So we need to target that server immediately. Now, we're already domain admin. It's not going to take long to do that. Okay, we can use several different techniques. There's lots of wonderful tools out there, and I will put into the text group here a reference sheet that you guys can use to kind of learn these tools. So we're going to compromise that system rather quickly, just like what we did with the domain controller to do a DC sync earlier. And we're going to enumerate the system, okay? We're looking for everything we possibly can, right? We only have a few days left, right? We're going to look for anyone who's active on the system, any credentials that are possibly there. Are there any SSH keys, secrets? What's the current network traffic doing, right? What are the current, A records, saved? What are the cache connections? What are anything that the system's been talking to? Any kind of files that we can use that we can pilfer through? Are there any configuration files? Any notes that someone left behind? We discover on the system that there is a thick client on there that is used to manage a very specific firewall cluster, which is references to that firewall document. And we also discover a network device configuration file. Now, on this file is the current running config, backed up like a day prior. There's also encrypted password hashes. Now, we unfortunately don't crack it, but that's okay. This is enough juicy data that we can now use to accomplish the rest of the objective. Maybe, but we really got to keep trying here. We see that someone, while we're on there, logs into the system, but we can't target that system that they're coming from because the network that we're on is a little bit more isolated and they're coming from someplace else and that was segmented, so it proved to be difficult. That's okay. Okay, fine. Let's do some key logging. Simple. Okay? And we are now very quickly watching this person type. And then they do a control V into the actual firewall management console. And we were so upset. We were watching this person for 3 days. Nothing. And then they do a control V. We don't even get the password. Nothing. And it was just very upsetting. But we weren't done yet. So we thought back and like, okay, is there any way that we can grab the clipboard data? Thankfully, someone made a tool for specifically that. It's called Sharp Clipboard. So we used that very quickly. Now, again, it took 3 days to really find this person, log into the console. So we knew we had to wait again. And at the same time, while this is happening, we're doing other parts. We're gathering the data that we currently had to kind of draft the report. But thankfully, we didn't have to wait too long because I think that very next night, boom, we got the clipboard content. We got the username. We got their password to the firewall that now manages the rest of the nuclear network firewalls. And we could then make our own rules. We could then change the way traffic's going to go. We could open up different ports to access directly. So it wasn't actually air gapped after all. And it was actually software gapped. So again, mission objective completed. We accessed the air gapped, quote unquote, nuclear network. And we learned a lot actually in this engagement. We learned one, of course, OSINT is very, very, very key. And weak password policies can be very detrimental, especially not updating them, right? That MFA portion was great. They used that code. That was fantastic. We couldn't get direct access into the VDI, which is good. Bad for us, good for them. While you're going on a red team, you need to keep track of everything you're possibly doing because you might need to use that to reevaluate and assess the situation for later. Okay, you got to be extremely patient because this is a red team, right? You can't just get an itch and just go for it, right? We're not, throwing axes through doors or anything like that. Okay, and also never trust someone that says their network is air gapped because it most definitely not. Okay, awesome. Other than that, I'm going to pass this over to Andrew.
Okay, give me a sec and I'll start sharing my screen and then we'll give you guys just a minute to switch on over. Okay, so as I go through this next part, if you have any questions as we're going, there's a lot of information here, a lot of things happening. If you're fast enough typing, just put it in chat and I'll try and fill in some of the information you guys might want to know as I'm presenting it to you. Okay. So my name's Andrew Major. I live in the same area as Kenny. I've spent most of my life in the GTA, but recently moved over to Ottawa. And I've been with the Mandiant IR team for about 3 years. That was basically right after I graduated from Sheridan. So I've come through the security program there. I did my co-op for a Big Four. And when I finally graduated, I said, where can I go do IR? Who are the best people at doing this, right? And honestly, I lucked into a job at Mandiant. My boss, who did a quick review of this, who actually filled out this bio for me. He liked attitude. And if you can go in with a good attitude and say, hey, maybe I don't know this, but here's how you can figure it out, you can get a lot of places. Okay. So things I don't want to say doing in my free time right now because this hasn't been recent with COVID, but I also do like to go off-roading. I've had a big built-up Jeep for a long time, and one of those things that I like to do in the summer is go off-roading with a group of people. And then Charles, my boss, who's now watching this, added in this hot dog royalty specialist. One of these things that we do when you come on to Mandiant is you give an embarrassing story, just something to introduce yourself, just make yourself a little bit more human. And I told a story about when I'd been on the front page of a national newspaper, holding a hot dog in a very suggestive way. And I said, go out, find it. We had people on our teams who were very, very good at finding information. Took about 3 years, and nobody actually found it. But the gentleman who just spoke, Kenny, is a good friend of mine, came over, went into my basement, took a picture of it, and then gave it to the rest of the company. I'm pretty sure he got paid for that, but he had a good time, and we stopped that challenge. I have to bring that one up quite often when we have our company holidays. Okay, so what are we going to take a look at? I'm going to show you some stuff. There's going to be some pictures in here. I want you to know that all these pictures are real. Charles, my boss, went and asked me today, how much of this did you make up? Because some of it looks funky. Absolutely nothing. Okay, you're going to see bad things happening. You're going to see people talking nonsense. That's just how it works. People freak out when you're going into an incident response. Okay. So we'll take a look a little bit of that attack life cycle and how we go through that, scoping out or what happens when somebody calls us for help, going in and what happens when you go into a network and there's an active attacker in there, right? Switching over a little bit to if ransomware successfully gets deployed, and in this case, I'll tell you it does just because we have that happening. And then something that doesn't happen too often is you find another attacker in there. Sometimes you have attackers competing to get stuff done, and in this case, that's what we ran into. Okay, so Kenny showed you a little bit of the attack life cycle, and this is how we look at it from a forensic point of view, an incident response point of view. Okay, you have all the same phases. You're looking at all the same things. You have your internal recon, your initial compromise, everything that you would think about when you're doing a red team. Okay? If you want to do pen testing, if you're doing hack the box, you got to do all these things. You're going through there. What's going to be good for you to keep in mind if you want to do IR is you really need to be detail oriented to find these things. But you also have to be willing to let it go. If you can't find something, you're not always going to be able to make that connection. It is very rare that we identify initial reconnaissance. A lot of the times you cannot find that initial compromise. You see somebody in an environment, but you can't figure out how they got there. It's just how computers work. Sometimes you don't have logs. Sometimes Windows hasn't recorded things. You got to be able to let stuff go when you're doing incident response. Just go with the flow type of thing. Okay? So how does this typically work? So Mandiant gets called for a lot of different incident response. That's what I would say we are most well known for, is our incident response. We work the biggest cases around the world with the most press along with it. Right? And what I'm showing you here is an email we got from a managed defense SOC analyst. Okay, so these are the guys who, they're part of Mandiant. They're not our consultants. They're not the people that go out. They are people who work in SOC who work for different companies. Okay, and even these guys who see this stuff every day, when an emergency comes in and they see something hitting the fan, you want to get that information out real quick. And sometimes it always doesn't flow together because you're just trying to type things up real quick. So I got an email We have a distribution list where anyone can get a hold of us. And we get an email from our managed defense SOC analyst who says they're working with a client. They have alerts on their ADR for 144 systems, and they think they have a good scope of what's going on. It's a little bit too much work to investigate that at a SOC level. They want to escalate that up to the incident response team. Because the incident response team gets dedicated people. We go in, we have however many people we need, and we can focus on that one client. Okay, as opposed to the SOC who's got to watch a couple hundred different people. But if you take a look at some of what's going on here, you can figure it out if you read it over and over again, but it's not great. And that's just because people are panicking, and it happens all the time. But they had, the SOC had opened up a RR, or a rapid response group, to try and take a look at this stuff as much as possible. But they were just running out of resources. They couldn't deal with it. So they had talked to the client in this case and said, hey, we recommend you go up to an IR, and we're going to put you in touch with people. Right? So even though we have a little bit of information about what's going on, we're always getting a call right at the beginning to scope it out. Okay? So myself and another analyst usually join a call. In this case, it was just me and one other person. And you can have varying levels of people in these calls. Usually you want a decision maker and you want some technical guys because they got to answer some technical questions for us just to get us going. Okay? When we go in, we find this place has roughly 6,000 systems. That's workstations, so laptops, everything like that. The big one that we take a look at a lot of the times is the servers, because attackers go right for those servers. Those are the things on all the time. Those are the things that have all the juicy data, things they want to get done. Okay, a few thousand employees, not too important, but we try to get an idea of what we're working with because we go in and we have no relationship a lot of the time with these companies. One of the big things we're always looking for is there a cloud environment? Okay, because there's a big difference in doing an investigation on your network and doing an investigation of all your cloud assets and anything that can happen in the cloud right now. So we're going in, we're trying to find out what's going on. We talk about technology. Ooh, they have some older firewalls. And with those firewalls, they have no logs. I hate going into these things, but this happens all the time. It tells me that we're just not going to be able to answer some questions that they're going to have. But you deal with the reality, you go in, you help people. Okay? They have 2 VPN servers. So we asked them, what are the different ways that you can get into your environment? Do you have a remote desktop exposed? Can your employees get in using some kind of virtual infrastructure? Is there VPN? How do people get into your network that could be abused? Okay, and they identified 2 VPN servers. And our very first question is there MFA on those VPN servers? And they say no. This is 90% of the time what's going to get abused at that point. Right? So we know a couple things as we're coming into this. Okay, there is EDR in place. We can use that. We know that there's an active attacker in there. They're getting alerts. They're coming in right now. Okay, they've been coming in for about 4 hours. So when we do this, unless we have a specific reason to think otherwise, a lot of the times this is going to end up being ransomware. So we go into this treating it as a potential ransomware that we got to stop. Okay. One of the things that they had told us as we were coming in is some of their systems were offline. They didn't scope that out. They didn't know what that was, but their email and their phones had gone down. It had gone down a couple hours ago. They didn't know if it was related. We'll figure that out later. Right now it's time to deal with the emergency. Okay, so we're going in. We know that the attacker's there. And we're saying likely, we don't know for sure. Objective is to ransomware that environment. Okay, these guys are in the healthcare industry. They have a lot of things that could be, I don't want to say destructive, but if the information gets out, it's really not good for individuals as well as research things that they're doing like that. Okay, we knew they had a little bit of a head start. They have that EDR on most systems. I'm going to say most because I'll say why that's important a little bit later. So we start collecting forensic information off of that. Okay, when you start pulling forensic information off of a system, it's not quiet. It doesn't use a little bit of resources. It uses a lot. We're going to kill your CPU. We're going to just rattle your hard drive. We could do this slow, but when we go in, we have that discussion, say, hey, we're going to be impactful to your environment in an attempt to save it. Is that okay? And every single time I've had that discussion, the answer is yes. Go ahead and do it. Okay. So we blast 6,000 systems to pull back data, all the forensic data you would ever need from 6,000 systems in about 2 hours. Okay, so we get so much back. One of the things that is a huge advantage at Mandiant is we've been doing this for a long time, and the company's built up indicators of compromise over a decade of experience doing this. Okay, so every time we find signatures for malware, different techniques, just any way that we can help identify an attacker, we built them into files that we can apply to that data that we've just pulled back to highlight them for everybody. Okay, so we pull that back, we apply our IOCs to take a look. We have a discussion with the client because, well, we don't know how they're in the environment yet. We want to limit how they're actually doing them. Okay, so how they can potentially get in. And because we have some alerts, we have some starting points. Hey, an alert came in saying this particular user ran some PowerShell. Now we know that user's compromised. Okay, let's take a look at where that user's been. I said when we came in, email was down. For some reason, it's up again. We do not know why. Okay, talk with the client. They haven't done a thing. Okay, I'll just bring in a little bit of context because we have some people asking questions about that and how do we do that. When we pulled data, in this case, it was through the FireEye endpoint agent. Okay, so FireEye is now separate from Mandiant, but they pull back and store on a cloud infrastructure, basically XML files that contain all the metadata of things that we're looking at. If I say we're pulling forensic data, they're going to go into the event logs and just dump all the event logs into a readable format for us and store it in the cloud. Okay, in this case, AWS. And how does blasting all 6,000 systems with forensic software impact an active attacker? They might know, they might not. It's a risk, but it's something you have to talk about with them, because at the end of the day, the ultimate impact to this organization, if ransomware does get deployed, is it's going to cost them a lot more and potentially a lot more damage if something happens with ransomware. All right. So one of those things that I just talked about was doing lateral movement analysis and taking a look at a known compromised account. In this case, an administrator account, or an account called administrator. Okay, and I just pulled this one up as a demonstration. Administrator is a very hard one to try and track down because it's just in use all over the place. But you can see, and I have these blurred out a little bit, you'll see nexuses, so central areas, where you're going to have specific systems that are blasting out the administrator account to many, many other places. Okay, and that's one of those things that we'll start focusing on. Okay, so why is so many connections coming out to the administrator account from this one system? A lot of the times when an attacker comes into the environment, they'll get credentials and they'll start scanning the network. As Kenny said, they were going to start enumerating shares. Okay, Kenny's on a red team. He's low and slow. He's being quiet. I want to say 95% of attackers don't care about that. They just want to get their objective done fast and get out. So you will see a single user hitting 2,000 systems within a couple minutes, and you're just going to see these nexuses of source systems of where those are coming from. It gives you an investigative lead. Focus on that system, see what they're doing. Okay? So we've been working at this point for, I want to say 16, 17 hours, because we came in, we knew that the attacker was active. We're not going to take a break. We're doing whatever we need to do to stop them from getting their objective. And what we're able to trace back from doing that lateral movement is they were coming in through a VPN. And hey, what did we talk about in that scoping call? They have 2 VPNs. There's no MFA on there. Ooh, that's a bad thing. Okay, so we talk about what the impact would be to them to have that turned off. And at this point, if we haven't already done it, we're going to bring in a remediation team. Okay, I'm not an expert in remediation. I'm an expert at investigation. So a lot of things I don't know about how to fix a network. And we're able to rely on different teams within Mandiant to bring that entire thing together. Okay? So we get somebody on the call who walks them through what exactly is going to happen, how much that's going to impact your business, how to actually do it. Because a lot of the times when we go in, there's some technical people there, but not many. Sometimes they just don't know how to do it. Okay? So we bring in those people with us, because I don't know how to do it. I don't know how to manage a Cisco firewall. Not my job. That's okay. We'll bring in whatever teams we need to bring that expertise. Okay? So we have analysts running down what the attacker is doing on certain systems that we're seeing them log into, and that takes a little bit of time. So my job as the lead here is to step back and see just what's going on in general. Okay, take a high-level look at what's going on. And one of those things that happened at the beginning was their email was down, their phone was down, some of their servers are down. What's going on? Okay. So I get in a separate call with these guys, and what they tell me is they don't have access to any of their servers, and they haven't now for about 15 hours. People are hyper-focused on what an attacker might be doing. They're not looking at the big picture. So that information never came to us. This is a big one, because if all your servers are not responding anymore, something likely happened. Okay? They can't ping them, so that means they're likely down, and all of their servers are on virtual infrastructure. Okay? So, man, I've run into this 100 times at this point in the 3 years I've been here. I have a high likelihood scenario in my head about what's about to happen, but I'm not going to tell them because I don't want to freak them out, just in case that wasn't what happened. Okay. But what happened is they tried to start logging into their virtual infrastructure, their ISSessions servers, and they couldn't figure out if they couldn't remember the password or somebody changed the password. They didn't have these noted down anywhere. All we knew at the end of the day is they could not get in. Okay. Unfortunately, as we desperately needed answers off of those systems, after a quick discussion, it was decided we were going to just nuke the operating system on one of these things. Okay. With the theory there being, you're not going to touch the data, so the area that stores the servers, you're going to nuke the operating system. You're going to reinstall the operating system. You're going to write down or save the password to log in this time. And we'll be able to get on there and see what, if anything, has happened to that data area containing all your servers. And exactly what we'd hope to prevent is somebody, in this case the attacker, had gotten on there and basically turned off their 300 servers and encrypted them all. Okay, with the exception of one, the email server. So that one server that we didn't know how it got up or why it had come back up. Early indications said it was the attacker. The attacker just did not touch this system. And that'll come back in a second here, okay? But this is basically what the ransom, well, this isn't basically, this is exactly the ransom note that we found, which is blurred out the URL and password details, okay? At this point, we hop on a call with, there must have been, I don't know, 30 people on this, because now you're talking about managers for the different areas of the company. You're talking about the CEO. And when we get on there, we also have the attacker get on this bridge. So the attacker somehow got information on where we were meeting, okay? And this ties back to the one server that they did not encrypt, their email server. And that's because they were on there and they were reading emails as they came in. So as soon as there was a discussion about ransomware and talking to people, they were like, oh yeah, we're going in, we're gonna listen. They were able to talk for about 5 minutes before we shut everything down, but they're basically, hey, we ransomwared your stuff, pay us. It's not gonna get any easier, just pay us. Okay. Unfortunately, this is basically how it goes. Okay. Yeah, do not report to the police, FBI. That happens all the time. And I want to tell you that it is incredibly common not to reach out and report that you've been ransomwared. Okay, it's usually an impact to your reputation. There might be fines you have to pay, things like that. We can never make that call. Mandiant can never ever make that call. We quite often work with the company's general counsel, and we'll quite often work with external counsel. So we end up working for that external counsel to advise them on how to advise their client. And that just kind of protects anything that we find within the investigation under a legal bubble, so it can't be discovered if there's a lawsuit. Okay? So at this point, we don't know how they got in yet, but we want to make sure we know what they did once they got in. Now, those 300 servers, they're not up. I can't pull forensic information from them. Ooh, that's the juicy area, because we know that attackers like to go on those servers, pull data. That's likely where they have their backdoors, if there are backdoors. Okay, but because there was an EDR running, we have some, I want to say, temporary information. Okay, things that were stored and sent up as alerts. Okay, so what are we able to tell right away? They were heavily utilizing obfuscated PowerShell. In this case, it's a newer module in Metasploit that just makes it so it's really difficult to decode the PowerShell commands that are actually running. Not that it can't be done, it just takes a little bit of effort. As I want my analysts to focus on looking at the systems that they can look at, we bring in another group, and we call them our advanced practice group. These are the guys who do our intelligence. They will assist you with trying to do attribution if you have questions about an IP address, a domain, some kind of TTP that you don't necessarily know yourself. This group are the guys who have the keys to the Mandiant Kingdom. Okay, so everything that we do goes into a database that very few people have access to, but they can go take a look at where this IP was seen across the thousands of engagements that we've done. Okay, so they'll be able to see what else was done when this IP was seen. And that's how we start to tie some things together. Okay. Doing some of that lateral movement analysis, we see the attacker log into two very, very large file servers. File servers aren't up right now. It's a problem. We can't inspect what they did, but we know they went there. There was an alert for our program called rclone.exe. If you don't do this type of thing, you're not going to know what this is, but it is a program that lets you copy things from the local system up to a very large number of cloud storage providers. Okay, so you can copy anything from here to AWS, to Azure. It'll go to Mega Upload, any of those file sharing sites that you may have heard of. This has functionality to get data there. So we don't know exactly what they might have transferred, or, excuse me, if they used it, but at this point we know it was there. Okay. Ooh, so we know that there's ransomware at this point. They don't have access to their servers. So legal's already been engaged, but they make the call to say the attacker likely has data. We need to start talking to them. This case was complicated a little bit more because their backup server was one of those 300 servers that was encrypted. So this is extremely common. A lot of times some companies just will not have backups, or if they do have backups, it's a system that gets hit by ransomware and they're not usable anymore. It sucks. It's just a way that a lot of places are set up. And this is one of those things that we help companies fix when we go in, because we're going to get a lot of things done on the remediation side, give them a lot of recommendations. But at the end of the day, they're likely to get hit again a couple years down the line. This is just a reality of being on the internet. We want to make sure that they are as prepared as possible for the next time something happens. Okay. So all those systems are down. I can't collect forensic data, but we have enough things pointing in the metadata that I do have to a very promising server. Okay. Unfortunately, that server did not have an EDR agent on there, so we have no visibility on there. We're just seeing references to that system from other systems that we see the attacker on. Okay, so we see an attacker log in to a server using remote desktop protocol. We investigate that second server, and it's going to tell us where they connected from. And every server that we're looking at that we know that the attacker went on, they were connecting from this one system that did not have an EDR agent. So if we can get things back up and going, we'll be able to take a look at what's happening. But until then, there's not too much we can do. Okay? At this point, I want to say at this point, it's been about a week. Okay? But the organization had opted to pay the ransomware. And this happens all the time. We will always recommend against it. It's not a good thing. But if you don't have backups, you can't get your stuff back online. Your business is going to go out of business if it can't operate again. So a lot of times the decision will be to pay the threat actors. Okay? And it's silly, but ransomware at this point is stupid big business. And they operate it as a business. They have full-time support. They have chat rooms. You go in there any hour of the day, there's going to be somebody manning that chat room. What you're seeing here is a report they give you at the end. If you paid, they're going to tell you how they got in and give you some recommendations. This doesn't happen with every group, but Hive, who we were working with here, does this. And it's just silly, right? Sometimes we can trust the information that they give you. Sometimes it's just bullshit. They said they get in through phishing. Great. I might not have seen that. I might not be able to find that, but that's how they're saying they got in. Okay. But the thing I absolutely loved about this note here is the advice that they give. Okay. So this client did not have great, I don't want to say didn't have great, had no password policies in place. Okay. They had domain administrator accounts. So guys with keys to the kingdom with a password of password1. You don't need to break that password. You can guess that within 5 guesses. Like, it is so easy. And I give you some of the, well, not some of the examples. These are the passwords that they gave back for domain administrator accounts that they had compromised. We had password 1. We had, I blanked it out, but the organization name 1234. Okay. We had passwords being reused. It is so bad. They said that you should use better security software than Microsoft Defender. Okay. And remember, they ended up going in and using one or two servers that did not have an EDR agent on there. So they didn't even have to fight against EDR. Nothing was getting detected on these places. Okay. Protect your VPN with 2FA connections. Once they had a password for the VPN, they could just get in. Okay? There was no protection in place at that point. There were no logs. Nothing was looking at this. Okay? Don't use VPN password for Windows domain password. Ooh. So there's different ways to set up a VPN and authenticate to a VPN. You can set it up to authenticate with your Active Directory, which makes it really easy to manage. Or you could have local accounts. Okay. And what happened is they had local accounts on this Cisco firewall, and the people who had made those accounts reused the same password that they had on the Active Directory. So as soon as the attacker had that Active Directory password, now they can go use that same password on the VPN. Made it incredibly easy for them. I would say ransomware case finishing up. This is a process. Depending on how many people were doing it, or how many people we have investigating, how long things take to get completed, either having the client do something, just taking a look at all the different places that an attacker went, you have to be very thorough. It takes some time. So ransomware case finishing up, I'm talking about a month later. Okay, so this takes some time to go through. But the high-level things that we figured out, okay? The attacker was able to RDP into 12 systems. They could have gone so many more places, but they only had to go to 12, okay? 2 of those servers that they went on were file servers. This is big because the attacker claimed and provided proof that they took out roughly 250 gigs of data, okay? So when the legal team is looking and talking with the attackers, I can't show you those kind of transcripts, but they're saying, hey, here's how much data we have. Hey, here's a file tree of everything we've got. Okay. And in this case, it showed about 75,000 different files that they said they had. During those negotiations, when usually a third-party company is trying to help out and lower that price that the attackers demanded, and then the attacker says, okay, here are the 75,000 files that we have. The client will go out and pick 4 or 5 files from that list. And they'll say, okay, to prove it to me, give me these 5 files. Okay? And usually they'll get passed back. And that's sort of like your proof of life to say that the attackers have stuff. That's all just part of the ransomware negotiation process that happens. Okay? But what did the attacker do while they were here? They got on those 2 file servers. That's the likely location where they grabbed those files. We don't know for sure. Sometimes you're just not going to know. Okay. They used one of those Active Directory credentials. This is a domain admin to log into the central virtualization infrastructure server, which is called vSphere. This manages all the individual virtualization servers. And you can just get in with an Active Directory account or an Active Directory admin account. Using that access, they changed the local root password to all those individual ESXi servers. Okay. They logged into those servers and ran their ransomware on there. So it shut down all of the servers, encrypted them, and they just left. So by the time we had gotten there, we were seeing them log out of systems and leaving, but they had already accomplished their mission by the time we got there, really. So these systems had been encrypted. We just did not know it yet. And unfortunately, that kind of thing happens. So we get systems decrypted because ransomware has been paid. But we still have some questions on what they did when they got in there. And one of those systems was in this case, it was a domain controller that did not have an EDR on there. Okay. So we get it back. We find the one backdoor this attacker has left within the environment. Okay. And we're diving deep on that system just to see what else could have been done, find new indicators of compromise, so we can take those indicators of compromise and look for them across the rest of the environment. And pardon me, I'm just going to pause here for a second. Okay. So we find Cobalt Strike, which is what Kenny was talking about in his presentation. They use Cobalt Strike as well. But we found something much, much worse. Okay. So if you're in probably third year at Sheridan, and I'm not sure about where the other colleges and universities are looking would be, but you're likely to take a forensics course, and in that course, it's going to teach you about something called an alternate data stream. Okay. And this is where we go from your typical ransomware attacker to much more advanced tactics. Okay. I'm going to highlight a couple things here. The MD5 of this file is D41. This is one you learn in forensics pretty fast because you see it all the time. This means it's an empty file. There's nothing in there. Okay. So we have a file in Windows System 32 called null. Well, that's obviously not a normal Windows file. And I want to say most of your EDR, every EDR that I've run across is going to see that file and move on. Okay. But what we saw in there was in the alternate data stream of that empty file. So I swear to God, if you right click on this file in Windows, it's going to say it's a 0-byte file, is a payload because it's hidden in the alternate data stream. Okay. And it is incredibly rare for that to happen. I've only ever seen one attacker group using that, and it was one of those things that led to where we're going to go here next. Okay. So using that payload, I bring it back to my team. We put it through our sandbox environment. Our sandbox environment isn't giving us too much. I'm not an expert at reverse engineering. Like I said, I'm an expert at investigations. But we do have a reverse engineering team. And we're able to give them a file, say, hey, can you take this apart? And within about 4 hours, they're going to come back. And what they came back and said is this is the Deadeye malware. Okay? And Deadeye malware is, as far as we knew at that time, and we still, this is our strong belief, is associated with APT41. Okay? So there's a lot that goes into doing attribution to say this is a group that's doing something. Some of it might be TTPs, so some of it might be malware used, common commands that they run, different ways that they run malware. It could be infrastructure that they use that gets shared over multiple campaigns. Okay, There's a lot of things that go into that. But what I knew at this point was we saw dead-eye malware and low-key malware. These are incredibly rare. You don't run into these on a ransomware case, okay? And dead-eye is, I want to say, it's a very complex loader. It doesn't do anything by itself. It is another malware delivery mechanism. So that null file that had something hiding in the alternate data stream was that dead-eye malware. And what it did was it deployed something called low-key. And low-key doesn't write anything to the system. There's no files. There's nothing that you're going to see on the system itself. It runs entirely in memory. Okay? But what it's going to do is it's going to bind to port 80 and 443 on web servers, which are incredibly hard to differentiate because those servers are supposed to be listening on these ports. So if you take a look on the system and you're, trying to see, hey, what processes are listening here? What connections are happening? This all looks incredibly legitimate. Okay, so it's hijacking existing infrastructure and things that are there. And even with our reverse engineering, we don't have this part, but you can activate the backdoor on this low-key malware if you know the magic key or the magic bytes that need to be sent to this open port. Okay, and that gives an attacker a way in. This one was a little bit harder. So what do we know about this client? They're not very mature. They have no logs. They're really not too visible on what's going in. They don't have too much technical expertise. We're not going to be able to get too many details out of what's going on. But because at this point we had a high likelihood that this was the return of APT41, and pardon me, I'm going to step back and talk about APT41 for a second here. APT41 is a Chinese national espionage group. Okay? So these guys who work for, I want to say declared Wicked Panda, same thing we're talking about here. If a country puts forward priorities, okay? They say over the next 5 years, we want to improve our stealth technology. We want to work on submarines or work on Air Force type of technology, missile technology. These APT groups or named groups will go out and try and focus on breaching companies or organizations that focus on those things that they can steal or information that they can get to give their country a competitive advantage. We saw a lot of this with COVID research. Okay, oh man, it's been a little while. I'm gonna have to do some math. But as vaccines were being developed, we had a lot of these APT groups or name groups breaking into medical research facilities because they wanted to steal the COVID research that the company had. Okay, this happens all the time. Now, particular to APT41, we know where they're coming from and what their objectives are. That's their day job. It is 100% their day job. And when they're done their 9 to 5, they go out and they hack for money. So I've run into these guys in Europe at casinos. I've run into them very rarely doing ransomware, but they will go in, break into places having nothing to do with, in this case, Chinese national interests, and just try and make some money for themselves. Right, so that's what we know about APT41. And as a company, we know a lot. That's just the information I know. I don't have access to everything. Okay. But as soon as my intelligence team says this is a likely APT41 attack, we're not quite there yet, but we're ramping up real quick. The FBI gets involved very quickly because as far as everyone knew at this point, APT41 was done. They hadn't been active for a couple of years. There was a couple of arrests that had happened, And at that point, the group went dark. Okay. So we had gotten on the call. We start sharing as much information as we can. Now, ransomware case, we can get away with, hey, maybe we don't know all the answers. Okay. But as soon as you see groups like this breaking into healthcare companies and things like that, it becomes national security. Okay. So FBI is able to help us. They put us in contact with this place's ISP and give them enough incentive to say, give Mandiant whatever they want for information. And we're able to start getting logs that we could not get from the client because their ISP has that information. Okay. From that, we're able to find out the different IP addresses that were accessing that low-key backdoor. In this case, there was 16 low-key backdoors on 16 different web servers. Okay. And we're able to find that over a roughly 6-month period of time, they took 36 gigs of data. I want to say we're done this investigation, but we were not able to conclusively say what data they took. But we know this place had a lot of proprietary information. They were part of not national defense, but they were tied into critical infrastructure. In this case, it was in the US, right? So it's going to be pretty impactful. Using the information that we were able to get here, and this is the first time we'd come back and we'd seen APT 41, right? We're able to take that IP address and find them where they had broken into 6 other organizations that we had network visibility into. So these are likely places that had FireEye agents, or they were managed defense clients. They were clients of Mandiant, and we had access into their EDR. Okay, but as soon as we found it in one place, we're able to go and say, hey, let's take a look across everything that we have access to. Let's share this with other organizations. Let's start finding out what's going on. And we found 6 other pretty critical places that they were currently in. So this was not they had been there and they're out. They were in there that day. Okay, so those spin off 6 more investigations, spun off more things that are outside of Mandiant. But that was where we were seeing the return of this group. Okay? And because I can't tell you a lot of stuff with APT stuff, it gets, man, even within the company, APT reports are locked down. So I might have somebody I work with all the time who works on an APT case. I will not know the details of what's going on in that person's case because I don't need to know. That's very confidential information for the companies. But we're able to start figuring out how they did this. And what we're seeing is they were exploiting a pretty recent in this case was, I don't know, a year back, 8 months back, a Java deserialization attack. Okay. And they were going to the companies or government websites that they were concerned about or wanted to break into, and they were sending their web pages this attack. Okay. And what they had done in the payload there was they had a ping command. Okay. And that ping command went back to some of their infrastructure. And as they're scanning 20,000 web pages or pages on a domain, it's really hard to figure out any individual system that you could break into. But when that system calls back to their infrastructure, that's just something they can log. So now they're attacking all over Canada, all over the US. And when they successfully are able to use this exploit on a certain system, it's just going to call back to them, and it's going to do it quietly. This isn't malware. This is just a ping request. Nobody's catching it. Okay? But this is how they got in. So they were able to exploit this deserialization attack. They knew that they could get in because the system called back to theirs. And from that, if you're able to execute a ping command, you have access to run things. In this case, they dropped a web shell onto the system. and then they drop their deadeye malware. And it is, I don't want to say nobody's picking up deadeye malware, but it would be very rare for somebody to detect that. So that's how these guys got around. Okay. So while that investigation's done, we don't know exactly what they took. We traced them around the environment. And like I said at the beginning of this, you got to be good with details, but you also have to be willing to let things go. Okay. You're not going to have all your answers sometimes. As much as you need to dig and just have a drive to find answers, sometimes you're not going to get them. And that's how it works with the APT and, in this case, ransomware engagement. Okay. So we had these guys who were dueling to get their things done. The ransomware brought down all of APT41's backdoors. And as soon as we brought them up, we saw APT41. And then we were able to get those guys out of the environment as well. That's what we have for a presentation. Okay. Kenny and I, Kenny can come unmuted, as well as Seb Prevost. If you guys have questions, we're happy to answer this stuff. Like, as much as we can bring to the table, maybe it's just we see all these things. We're really good at what we do. So if you have questions or want to know how things are going with, hey, you're doing instant response. What's good? What's bad? You're doing red team. What do you like about it? Any questions you guys got? Happy to answer.
Thank you, Andrew and Kenny. So what I've done is I've allowed permissions to unmute. If it's okay if people voice their questions. Sounds good. So yeah, feel free to put your questions in the chat or unmute yourself and ask.
Give me them questions.
Is a little bit of a tradition at Mandiant. So we'll do presentations like this here. We'll go to conferences, these tales from the trenches. If you're going to other places, you'll see these from time to time. And they're always a good time when you go there.
Hey, it's Todd from KPMG. That was an awesome presentation, guys. And I would love to ask a question about one of the challenges that you raised earlier. I guess as incident responders, one of the challenges that we face is that sometimes we don't actually have, all the visibility that we want, or sometimes even access to sort of our preferred toolkit. How do you guys deal with that? What are some strategies for kind of building your repertoire, or, I guess getting good at working with little resources?
Yeah, at the end of the day, you just have to be able to accept that you might not be able to do that. So we have our preferred tools, right? Of course, so Mandiant was part of FireEye for the longest time. We would always recommend and push out FireEye agents to collect our data. We've since become much more tool agnostic, but if a company has EDR in place, use that EDR. If they don't, we'll give them ours. But along with that lack of data type of thing, if we go in and they don't have logs for their firewall, there's really nothing you can do about it today, right? We can help get them set up for things in the future, but that today problem isn't going to change, and we just have to accept that reality and work with what we can.
Thanks so much.
I see a message. Who was that saying Redline is fantastic? Todd, I love you for saying that. I absolutely hate Redline.
I was gonna say, I was like,
all those old free FireEye tools they're a good time.
Yeah. So two of the challenges that we've set up for the CTF, the forensic challenges are going to use Redline. I'll be around to help support stuff for you guys. I hate Redline, but that's what we're using there. So it'll give you guys a good introduction to a forensic tool.
So, Biduman asks, how do you know when it's time to let something go Sometimes the rabbit hole runs so deep, how do you decide there's nothing there? Happens quite often in my line of work. I'm sure same thing with Andrew. So I personally, we have a more of like a deadline, and I wouldn't. It can be a very flexible a bit. It depends. Normally, it's very much fixed, depending on what the client needs and when they need it by. So usually, if we are going down a path and it's not turning up results within like a day, let's say we the red team, it could be 2 or 3 people on the red team, we all mutually agree that this path is the path to go down. For instance, the vulnerable web application during my presentation, right? That was awesome. Like we didn't even have to fish. There would be no alerting. There'd be nothing. The problem is that there were so many other defenses there. It was like, okay, maybe in our experience, it might be a little bit easier to target people that we already have the password to. We already know that they're going to be domain joined. There's a little bit of a risk that they might get detected, but that's just a phishing campaign, right? So it really does come down to a risk reward from our perspective. Is it worth the risk, really? And is it going to be done in a reasonable amount of time? That's the one thing I will say when you get into consulting. If anyone is to choose to get into consulting, is time management. And so that's a great question, and you kind of have to learn that as you go.
On the incident response side, it's experience. When you come in and start doing this, our associates, we give them time to let them go down these rabbit holes, because you have to learn basically that it is a rabbit hole. And the next time you see it, maybe you go down it again. Maybe you've learned that you don't need to, but it's doing 100 investigations. And once you've had those 100 investigations under your belt, you have a good idea of leads that are much more unlikely to be fruitful.
One more interesting question for you guys. How do you deal with false positives?
That one, I'll start there. That was one. False positives happen all the time, and it is. We have a couple strategies to look at that. With the software that we use on the back end to review, so this is not stuff that people have access to. This is not something that anyone outside of Mandiant would ever see. We have ways to apply filters to try and get rid of some of that noise. The other thing we do is frequency analysis. So we'll use statistics. So if we have false positives on this system generated these 20 false positives, or we don't know if it's a false positive yet, but we see these same things happening on 6,000 systems at a time, and it's just common within the environment, then that leads us to believe that we can likely just move on from this. Okay, so seeing what's common within that environment, even if we haven't seen it before, helps us get rid of those false positives.
We validate for our end, right? If we discover that something is vulnerable, if it looks like a duck, we better quack like a duck. Otherwise, we're not going to report on it, right? It depends on the situation. A lot of times, we might not be able to exploit it, and so we will validate with the client. If it's a pen test, especially on a red team, it's usually discussed during the status call. So on red team and pen tests, you usually have weekly status updates where you and the client have just a nice 30-minute discussion about what's going on. And so if you do discover something and you can't quite determine if it's a false positive, you would kind of validate with the client, and they might give you the intel, and they might not. A lot of cases they do. Sometimes they don't, and that's just the way it is. Yeah, a lot of it is just ensuring that you validate, because I mean anybody can run an SScan and then it come back saying like, oh, it's vulnerable to all this stuff because it's an outdated SQL thing. It's like, yeah, but did it actually get the version number? Did it actually check if it is vulnerable to print nightmare, that kind of thing? Because a lot of systems might not actually be vulnerable to something, even though that your scanner tool said it was, right? And that's a big difference in how you determine, or that really kind of separates consultants from just anybody that's going to run a tool. See that someone asked about the strategic wing. That's a good question. Basically, the strategic wing, the strategic side, strat. I work with them quite often. I think you do too, Andrew. Often. I don't know. I work with them.
And then I'll talk about how we use them in IR.
Yeah, for sure. So basically, what happens is for us, they usually go on and they will perform an assessment of kind of like benchmarking of what the current client has, and they will kind of gear the assessment based on their environment. A lot of it is a lot of workshops and asking, validating what processes and procedures the company has, and then from there they will then determine what route to take for the services, such as if they need to have IR come in and do a sweep of if there was a past compromise, or pen testing team to come, or the proactive side to come in and do a ransomware assessment, right? Like they might go in and determine that we can validate that you would be vulnerable to ransomware, or we can test to see your defenses against ransomware if we have if we have the proactive team to come in and actually perform a ransomware assessment where we simulate being very, very basic type of ransomware attackers, right? A lot of like what Andrew discussed. Let's go ahead, Andrew.
Yeah, so when I go into an incident response, it's actually very rare that I don't bring the strategic team. There's lots of teams that do strategic type of work, recommendation type of work, validation type of thing. We have a team we call an STS team, and these are basically the incident response troops for the strat team. And they have a wide range of expertise in Active Directory and normal type of appliances, things that you're going to find within an IR. And they come in, and while I'm doing the investigation, they are helping the client prepare to get an attacker out of the environment. What are those steps that need to be done once the investigation is wrapped, or if the decision comes to pull the trigger and kick an attacker out right now, what needs to be in place for those things to happen? They'll advise them on things like doing enterprise password resets. As much as a password reset might seem like a simple thing, there's a lot of complexities to it. There's service accounts that applications use that haven't been changed in years, and you might not know how to change the hard-coded passwords in an application. The developers might have left for who made that application. There's a lot of things that can go wrong with that type of thing. They'll be able to advise on different 2FA solutions. We usually get Active Directory information and start seeing, hey, here are the usually 30 critical things that need to be changed in your Active Directory just because they are so poorly configured. At this place, as an example, where we just talked about the ransomware, they had a misconfiguration that said anybody in their IT group was actually part of the domain admin group. So they had 157 domain admins. Should never have happened. Our strat group was able to go in during that investigation, identify that, and get them to fix that up. Okay, so that's how we do that. I'm seeing another question here. Believe that you mentioned during an investigation, the investigator does not talk about APTs that are working on with other investigators. After the investigation is complete, do you discuss internally some of the unique findings that were discovered about the APT group? So when we do APT groups, or more, I want to say harder groups to deal with, we 100% bring those in. I might not have the details about what happened because I'm not allowed to access a report, but I know the people that work those cases. So we have a dashboard that says, hey, at this case, might not say the client, okay, but it'll tell me who worked it, and it'll tell me who it was attributed to, okay? So I know the people that have worked against these before. We also have our intelligence group. So those guys that I told you will do that attribution. These guys sit behind the scenes on every single case that we do. and they are able to provide that information. So they are that conduit to say, hey, we're working with this group now. Here are the things that we've seen on other cases, and they will feed things from our case to other investigations as well. If we had 5 APT 41 cases going on at the same time, we might just have Intel who's sitting in all those cases, making sure that the different teams know what's going on. Or we might have a large chat that'll have all the investigators from the different ones in there. But at the end of the day, when it comes time to wrap up and do those reports, a lot of that information gets locked down again, just because you don't want the details of how an APT got into the biggest companies in the world available to anybody who joins the company, right?
So Todd, that's actually a very good question on what opportunity in the near future do you see for Purple Team become more of a mainstay in organizations with heightened cybersecurity maturity? We definitely see that now. In the few years that I've been here at Mandiant, I've seen quite a number of Purple Teams occur. Usually it will depend on, obviously, the maturity of their environment. I've seen it where we would be on a pen test and either there was clear indicators that there was some gaps that would have to probably be filled in with a Purple Team, like when we're on their network and we're doing certain activity, and they might see some of it and they might lock down another bit of it, but they just didn't have the full set of capabilities to really or detect us or anything like that or alert on it. So that's when we would follow up with a Purple Team, or sometimes it just happens right away. Maybe Strat determines that based on what they find in the workshops, or that might come after. Like Strat is it's called strategic for a reason, because they are very, very good at fine tuning and really honing in on a company, what a client really, really needs, and delivering in on that. So, but I think that it's already here. It's definitely happening, and I think that now, especially, there's probably going to be even more of it happening. But I'm not the sales guy. I'm just the hacker guy. So
we also see a little bit more purple teaming trends by nation. In Canada, we don't do them too often right now. Definitely happening, but I see them happening a lot more from U.S. companies right now as well.
Yeah, that's true.
As a follow-up, are there any other interesting trends in terms of where the Canadian market is sort of falling behind the US on this stuff?
That's a little bit more out of the area of expertise that I have. So unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to do that one for you.
No worries.
Yeah, same. That's a higher up question. Awesome. Thank you, everyone. And if anyone does have any questions at all, ever, even if it's just advice, down to even mentorship, just hit us up. Andrew and I are not active in the IS channel, but we are still pretty active within that. You can reach out to us anytime. Maybe not Andrew, I guess. But you can definitely find him. And if not, hit me up and then I'll find him for you.
Okay, I'll put this out there too. If any of you can find the hot dog picture and you do not get it from somebody at Mandiant, we'll figure something out and get a reward of some kind. We'll do that.
Somebody hit me up. I got you.
Find out you got it from Mandiant though.
No. I'll direct them to somebody else.
Well, thank you guys so much. Excellent talk. I think the information that you provided was invaluable. So yeah, I think that will wrap up the workshop for tonight. As Andrew and Kenny mentioned, if you have any further questions, you can drop them in the chat. You can reach out to them, or well, Andrew said he's not he's not that active in the IS sessions. I was going to say you can put your questions in the IS sessions chat, but he probably won't see it.
You ping me, we'll get it.
Okay, awesome. Well, Again, thank you so much, guys. Yeah, I think that's about it for tonight. For anyone who's interested in coming out for tomorrow's workshop that will be hosted by Lairs, the documents for that workshop is posted within that channel. So please do take a moment beforehand to download the materials. And yeah, that's it.